All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just as a reminder, we do have some refreshments and snacks. If you want to grab any, please feel free. My name is Yvette, and I'm with the UNLV Palestine Coalition, and we're a group of students, faculty, and friends who are working together in support of Palestinian liberation. Before I begin, I just want to thank the UNLV Feminist Club and the Middle Eastern Law Student Association at Boyd Law for partnering with us to host this panel. Bridging the gaps between colleges, students, faculty, and subject matter experts is a testament to the strong solidarity of listening to the suffering of the Palestinian people and of their land. So I'm grateful to share a space with all of you as we continue to step up and speak out. So without further ado, because you are not all here to see me today, it's my privilege to introduce two esteemed panelists who bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise to our discussion today on the humanitarian and legal status of Palestine. Our first panelist is Professor Michael Kagan, and he is the Joyce Mack Professor of Law at UNLV William S. Boyd School of Law. It's a mouthful. So Boyd Law. And Professor Kagan teaches administrative law, professional responsibility, and immigration law. With years of experience in building legal aid programs for refugees throughout the Middle East and Asia. He has lived in Cairo, Beirut, and Jerusalem, and taught at Tel Aviv University and the American University in Cairo. He's also published scholarly articles on Palestinian refugee rights and the role of UNRWA and UNHCR in the Middle East, and was a consulting attorney with the Negotiation Support Unit in Ramallah, which advised the Palestinian Liberation Organization on negotiations with Israel. I can have just a really quick round of applause. And joining him today is attorney Yasmin Omar, an international human rights lawyer renowned for her unwavering commitment to defending victims of human rights violations. With a decade of legal practice in Egypt, Yasmin brings invaluable firsthand knowledge of the challenges facing individuals in conflict-affected regions. Since her relocation to Las Vegas in 2019, she has spearheaded the Democracy Matters initiative at the Middle East Democracy Center, amplifying voices for justice and accountability. Yasmin's contributions extend beyond legal practice, as she served as a consultant with the United Nations on issues of the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict settings. Her tenure as the UN and Regional Mechanisms Manager at the Committee for Justice and as a legal associate at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy attest to her dedication to advancing justice and human rights on multiple fronts. Together, our speakers will offer a comprehensive understanding of the humanitarian and legal complexities surrounding Palestine, drawing from their extensive experiences and dedication to advancing human rights globally. So please join me in welcoming both of them to our panel discussion with a round of applause.
Right. Thank you very much, Yvette. And I'm going to talk, obviously, that there are a long list of legal issues involving Israel and Palestine that we could talk about. You can't ever separate them all entirely, but I'm going to focus everything on the big question that people are talking about today. Well, one of the big questions people are talking about today, which is the question of genocide, specifically as it relates to Gaza. But before I get to that, I just want to say I was really grateful to be asked to participate in this. And I think it's really important, no matter what you think about this, it's really important at universities in particular that we continue to be able to have civil discussion about these issues, hopefully you can be the judge, hopefully intelligent discussion about it. It's under threat in our country and has always been under threat in many places. And if we lose the ability to do that at universities, we've probably lost that ability to have these discussions anywhere, and that would be incredibly tragic for us. Let me get to it on the issue of genocide. So in international law, genocide is a crime. And it has a definition actually much like other crimes, like larceny. It's important to realize that there's often in legal terms, there's a rhetorical use of the word that you can discuss whether genocide means the same thing rhetorically as it does legally. Some of the debate around genocide might suggest that some differences of opinion about that, but I'm going to focus on genocide as a legal matter And as a crime, as we teach in first year of law school, crimes usually have two parts, an act and an intent. So I'm going to read the actual legal definition, and then I'll go through the act and intent and summarize in a pretty superficial way, given time, how that might apply and where the difficulties in applying it might be in the case of Gaza, and specifically in Israeli military actions in Gaza. So genocide, this is from the United Nations Convention on Genocide. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with an intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And then it lists the acts: killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring apart its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So basically, there are many ways in which I think what we've all seen go on in the Israeli invasion of Gaza and attacks on Gaza meet the acts part of this. Obviously, some of them are in direct killings. That's the first possible act. Bedrock principle, one of the most important principles of the law of war, is the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants. Even when a combatant is involved or a legitimate military target involved, there has to be proportionality. And the level of destruction that we have seen here, we're looking at a death rate of about 250 people being killed per day. It's probably the bloodiest war so far this century in raw death toll. The level of leveling of a city that we often see in photographs is essentially similar to the leveling of cities in carpet bombing in World War II. The degree of targeting that one can say in many of these attacks has been considerably lacking. That ranges from bombs, many of which have done dumb bombs dropped on apartment buildings. Human Rights Watch just produced a report about a single attack on a residential building that killed 106 civilians, about half of them children, without an apparent military target. But even if a member of Hamas military wing lived there, whether killing one person at the cost of 106 others, that there'd be a serious problem of proportionality there. But that's actually just the start of it. In fact, those are often some of the more defensible measures, because one can at least debate, was there really a legitimate target or not? Investigation is really incredibly important. Human Rights Watch devoted months of investigation to that one attack that occurred in October, and just published that report in February. And obviously, there have been a lot of other residential buildings destroyed, and that's just one type. There's also been very important right now and very relevant to the issue of genocide, infliction of famine. That becomes really important when we get to intent elements. I'll come back to that in a minute. But there was early in the war, seemed to be systematic targeting of bakeries. Bakeries were destroyed repeatedly until there were no bakeries left. In addition, of course, to hospitals, which have attracted a lot of media attention, and cutting off of food aid, importing of food not being available, essentially siege warfare of a medieval type, where essentially the entire population would be cut off from supplies, whether medical supplies or basic nutrition, until famine sets in a region that is not lacking for food. So it's not like this because of the climate that there's a famine going on, obviously. Also, essentially, a lot of killings that seem to just be indiscriminate shootings. Basically, countless examples now, people going to aid stations being shot, ambulances being attacked, and then another ambulance being attacked. We just saw this with the World Central Kitchen attack, but it wasn't a really unique attack that's happened over and over again. And it's to such an extent that it has affected some of the hostages. So there was the incident where 3 of the Israeli hostages escaped in a Israeli military, after an Israeli military raid, which was a legitimate military operation, and came out waving a white flag, half naked and bare chested, and then were shot by Israeli forces. That is not also the only time that people waving white flags have been shot. So that it seems to be a no quarter given policy across the board. So those are the kind of acts that we could look at. There's a long discussion that one can have about each one of those. And I do want to, it's important actually to understand before I get to the intent element, everything I just said, even if we took genocide off the table, could also be individual war crimes, each individual case, and also could be crimes against humanity. For it to be a crime against humanity, these things would need to be systematic, but would not need to have this special intent element that I'm about to talk about. And it's important to keep that in mind, where I hope we get to prosecutions later on. I think a lot of the debate, and I think the legally most difficult debate about whether this is genocide, has to do with the intent element. So I want to go back to that definition, is that before we get to the acts, it says genocide means any of the following acts: committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. So it doesn't have to have an intent to destroy all of the Palestinian people, or even all of the Palestinian people of Gaza, but there has to be an intent, a specific intent to destroy, at least in part, the Palestinian people or Palestinians of Gaza. And this is a complicated case, and it's not an easy case. And when eventually, I hope that there might be a trial at the International Criminal Court, I am not sure how it will go, to be honest. I do think that there is likely genocide here, but I think one should have an open mind because this is a high threshold. It's a special intent crime. It's also most likely a mixed motives case. One of the things that people ask is, how can it be that Israel had a legitimate right to defend itself after Hamas and Islamic Jihad's attack on October 7th, in which they may have, there's also a good discussion of whether they had genocidal intent. That's also worth discussing, and I hope gets discussed and gets put on trial. But how can Israel have a legitimate right to respond to that through self-defense and then be accused of genocide? It's actually fairly easy. And don't just think of countries fighting each other. It's pretty easy for 2 people to get into a fight, a long simmering fight. And one person, maybe at one point, to have a legitimate right to use some force in self-defense, but for that to very easily morph into not a need for self-defense, but now a desire for revenge. And it's very easy to go from a desire for revenge to a desire to destroy. And unfortunately, in the context of what we have here of ethno-nationalist conflict, it's actually super common that you end up almost with mutual, can have mutual desires to destroy, and that does not absolve either party. And I have said, I gave a talk about Palestinian refugees in November, and I referenced the fact that I've spent my whole career working with refugees, many of whom have fled ethnic conflicts from many other countries, and I know people often find this hard to hear. I don't think much is special in the Israeli and Palestinian case, except perhaps the degree, in this case, of the sophistication of the military and the degree of destruction capable. So let me go through the intent element, because there is evidence. But I do also want to say, having lived and worked in Israel, it's not a monolithic society. I would fully suspect that within the Israeli army, there are units, commanders, and soldiers who have in their minds only a legitimate desire for self-defense of their country. There also can be misguided self-defense. So there's a whole other strategic question about how Israel has carried this out, which I think is relevant, but you can have misguided self-defense and it wouldn't be justified. It wouldn't be genocide. But there is an array of evidence suggesting that this is genocide, that these actions are with intent to destroy Palestinian people in whole or in part. In any area of law, in all kinds of cases, we can prove intent by both direct and indirect evidence. Direct evidence, what comes out of my mouth? I took your wallet because I wanted the money. I could say that. And if then I actually take your wallet, a jury can conclude that's why I took it. Or you could just judge from my actions that my intent was probably to get the money, even if nothing comes out of my mouth. That's indirect evidence of intent. So we do this all the time routinely. Courts have to make inferences about intent because most defendants don't actually just come out and say their reasons. So we often infer them from actions. Here we have a lot of direct evidence. And to be clear, a lot of Israeli leaders have expressed a desire for self-defense, but they have also said other things. So for example, the president of Israel has said that there are no innocent civilians in Gaza, rejecting the principle of distinction that's at the heart of international law. An entire nation is responsible, he said. That seems to come very close to expressing an intent to destroy or to fight an entire nation, not only combatants. He's a ceremonial officer for what it's worth, although prominent. The prime minister is famously referred to the Amalek allegory in ancient Hebrew law, which is seen as a permission to wage war on an entire people, not only on combatants. The Minister of Defense has probably been the most prolific. He said, I have removed all restraints. We will eliminate everything. He said that on October 10th. And I think one of the things when we look at this intentional infliction of famine and deprivation of food and all of the many actions that interconnect with that, his statement on October 9th that there will be, quote, a siege, and that there will be no food, no fuel, everything is closed, seems that not only did they follow with actions that look like a siege, the Minister of Defense said that was exactly what they planned to do on October 9th, very beginning. So usually a prosecutor would be pretty happy to have a quote from a defendant saying, this is my criminal intent, and then you have the act following the intent. Now, there's a longer list of examples, but that's from high leadership. There are other examples. We also can look at statements that are made by middle-level military commanders. And I think one of the things that's also come out over the last 2 months or so, the prolific video and social media posts of Israeli soldiers, many of which incredibly dehumanizing, taking great joy in the destruction of homes, mocking of Palestinians, playing with women's lingerie after going into people's homes that they were forced out of, things of that nature, and generally, actually often quite directly expressing a desire to destroy. Now, those are low-ranking soldiers, but they are part of the army that is conducting this. It's relevant evidence. Indirect evidence would be the fact that some of the strategic issues, although interesting in a sort of outside legal framework or outside moral framework about just what is Israel's end game, what can they actually accomplish, are they pursuing a strategy, a means that matches any realistic ends? Those are all really interesting conversations, but we also have a situation where their actions really don't seem very well to correspond to any legitimate military aims, but actually seem much better explained by just a desire to destroy. And it's a much simpler explanation for what we see than trying to understand how some of what is going on in Gaza is actually, well, that's really all part of the battle against Hamas. It's a lot harder to follow for anyone familiar with for how Hamas actually operates and for what actually should be achieved. And finally, when we look at indirect evidence in context, this didn't start on October 7th. Now, October 7th was an awful attack. It's starting point already, crime against humanity, if not worse than that, on the part of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. But it's not the beginning of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The fact is that there has always been a desire within the Zionist movement for the Palestinians to not be there, ranging from, as I was taught as a child, to just say they aren't there, actually they were, or to engage in policies to force them out. And unfortunately, I don't think we can look past that context either when we look at how this war has been conducted. Like I said, I don't think this is an easy and simple case for proof in terms of the intent. And I think the biggest legal question would be about that special intent element. I do want to note, though, that even if you find for the defendant on the special intent, you're still left with the alternative charge of crimes against humanity. That gets me really briefly, I've probably gone way over to the International Court of Justice. There are really kind of two international bodies that, well, actually, there's several that couldn't be involved here, but in terms of courts, there's the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. Now, I said this is a crime. So, and like all crimes, you really need to eventually have a full investigation. You need to have a full airing of all the evidence and the issues. And the International Criminal Court is the best place to do that. I hope that happens. One of the other things that's really important about the International Criminal Court, it has jurisdiction here because Palestine has agreed to its jurisdiction. It can and it should investigate both Israeli crimes and Palestinian crimes. And I hope that it does. It's a great opportunity to show that law applies to all and that there's no special rules, and that regardless of whether you think your cause is just, that there are things that just cannot be done among human beings. And I think there's a great opportunity to show that. And I think only it takes time to sort out any criminal trial. And I think that would be the best format to come to a conclusive decision about this. But before we get to that, as with any violent crime, the first thing we need to do is prevent it, or if it already started, stop it from being worse so that we can start to think and collect evidence and help the wounded. And the ICJ's role, what South Africa petitioned for, is more along those lines, the request for preventative measures. The ICJ has decided, so they eventually, but probably only after several years, may come to a conclusion of their own about whether this was genocide. I pray that the fighting and killing will have long stopped by the time they get to that. But what has gone on so far is they have found that the allegation of genocide is plausible. As I read that in international law, it's fairly analogous to an American standard of probable cause. You know, what it would take the police to get a warrant to search your house. It doesn't mean you're guilty. And based on that, they've ordered some preventative measures, but not others. They have actually not ordered a ceasefire. There's a split on the court. Only a minority of the judges on the court demanded a ceasefire. They have ordered Israel not to kill more people. And their second decision ordered immediate cooperation between Israel and all agencies of the United Nations to allow food aid in. That has not happened. Their attention, especially in the second decision, was very focused on the famine issues. But again, the ICJ, those measures are preventative. It is not a definitive conclusion that genocide is happening. It is a definitive conclusion that there is a risk of genocide here, a probable cause or plausible genocide, and we need to prevent it. I do want to note one thing about the ICJ, which is, I think, is an unfortunate feature of international law. Its jurisdiction on this kind of procedure is limited to genocide, which is why so much focus gets put into this one definition with that intent element. If the ICJ had jurisdiction, over crimes against humanity, some of the legal discussion would actually be quite a bit easier, but they have very narrow limits on their jurisdiction. Apologize for taking up more time than I was allowed it.
Not at all. I believe it was pretty essential and a great start for our discussion today. Thank you so much, Professor Kagan, for your expert explanation of the crime of genocide and the outlining the legal framework concerning the ICC, the ICJ, and all the legal proceedings about the genocide in Gaza. Well, first I'd like to thank you all. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for holding what I believe is a very vital, essential series of discussion, something that we lack here in the US, something I find very hard to have a civilized conversation about these sensitive issues. However, it's not too sensitive, and it is our reality, and we need to address it as hard as we can. As international legal practitioners, academics, this is a profoundly unsettling time. It feels that the foundation that underpins our efforts in defending human rights, fundamental human rights, are under threat. However, I believe that the law might sometimes work against us without without policies that directed towards actually functioning and protecting human rights around the world. International law was essentially created to maintain and promote peace. It cannot be the sole mechanism to do that. Building on this foundation, I believe that it's crucial to examine the role of powerful global actors such as the United States, how their role is derailing peace. And we need to explore how foreign policy aligns, or in this case, I would say misalign with international norms, international law, particularly in the context of the illegal occupation in Palestine historically. We must also consider the broader implications that undermines international legal protection of the global system and accountability for human rights abuses that starts actually from the attack on Gaza. The US provides substantial aid to Israel, whether it's financially, military aid. Every year, Israel gets $3.8 billion, plus a substantial amount of supplementary funds that has been just discussed and probably approved to be given $14 billion in military aid to Israel. This actually not only fall in violation of international law that commits states to abide by international law, to adhere to what these states are doing with this military aid, and if it's involving grave human rights violation, it actually lays in the US laws itself. Most recently, last February, NSM 20, which is the National Security Memorandum on Safeguarding and Accountability with respect to transferred defense articles and defense services, that obligates the US government to examine military aid before giving it to a country who might involve human rights violations in its use. Many US, there is actually, when we review these policies, you would see that there is a gap between these legal obligations and the actual policy execution. And these laws are usually challenged by the state itself. After issuing such law, we see that US State Department and Secretary of Defense announcing that their team of lawyers haven't found Israel in violation of human rights in Gaza. I would say you need new lawyers, because it's evident UN jurisprudence experts, everybody is admitting to how grave are the human rights violation. The ICG saying that genocide is plausible. When powerful state policies, not just the US, negate strong analysis recommendations by the UN experts that says that the lack of enforcement of international law complicates the acknowledgement of the Palestinian people to right to self-determination, right to actually armed resistance. We would see that this actually plays as a wall between the execution and the influence of international law and the other way towards conflict and war. The genocide in Gaza and the question of genocide in Gaza. Well, daily for the last 6 months, we have been seeing on social media, on TV, daily horrible genocide scenes in Gaza. Deaf debate about the legitimacy of such horrible acts in Gaza, and the persistent failure in delivering very essential aid until very recently. This has created and even when the ICJ ordered provisional measures and that obligates Israel to at least deliver essential aid, we see that there is a growing indifference towards human rights violation generally, not just in Gaza, but all over the world. And that extends even beyond Palestine. During the very severe attack on Gaza, and I'm mentioning this specifically for the Middle Eastern Association, Law Association, we have been seeing growing in authoritarianism all over the world, and therefore human rights abuses, from mass arrests to protesters for Palestine here in the US, in Germany, and even in countries in the Middle East.
accompanying this, we'd see mass executions in Saudi Arabia. We'd see mass unfair trial, secret unfair trials in Emirat, in UAE. We'd see that there is fraudulent elections passing in Egypt, and for the first time in US history, they don't comment, it passes with complete silence, complete impunity, and complete sustaining to the situation that allows strategies like befriending authoritarian government to allow for this, the silence of around the horrible genocide in Gaza. Complete impunity leads to the weakening of international law mechanisms. This way, the way that the US, for example, has been using their UN veto, their UN position within the UN Security Council, just a few hours ago, the US was the only country that voted against the acknowledgement of a Palestinian state. How come in an international fair system, one country, although like 140 countries that accepted the joining of Palestine to the UN, out of 193 countries, and yet the US is sustaining this narrative of completely marginalizing the right of the Palestinian people to determination and to legality existing in a legal way. Well, this takes us to what this brings us now. Israel and the US are setting a precedent of exceptionality in the application of international law. We'd see that target assassinations from Israel against Palestinians are announced proudly, although that it targeted 3 and 4 years old children. Targeted assassination, the killing without a legal procedure, without legal proceedings, is called extrajudicial killing under international law. It's prohibited under the law, and it cannot be justified under the right of self-defense or other if it does not consider law of warfare. However, we see that when the US and other powerful countries' foreign policy allows the questioning around such act, we see that international law application gets harder. What about Myanmar? What about human rights violations in Sudan? What about human rights violations in Libya and others? Why would they accept international law application if we have a precedent for exception? And this, not only the only example, but also the United States has long tried to pressure Palestinians not to seek the right to determination through the United Nations. It's important now to ask yourself, why do we have the United Nations? Why international law matters? Well, these mechanisms were created to save the world from conflict and war and provide other plans for prosperity and for peace. However, when this happens after World War II, the world thought that states are true representatives of their own people. However, it's very hard to say now that these mechanisms are working for the people, or that states are actually representative of their own people, with growing authoritarianism and weakening application of international law. Well, we didn't get here immediately, and the story did not start on 7th of October. However, this has been happening for decades. There were strategies designed to weaken international rule of law and replace it with other means to control the narrative of peace and war. And among this is the Abraham Accords, is normalization agreements, is befriending authoritarian and autocrats leaders around the world. And this is the US and other powerful players around the world presenting armed trade / military aid as an alternative for peace, as a solution to achieve peace. This is actually conductive to conflict and war more than provocative for peace and for other conflict resolutions means. And this way, the rule of law and international legal mechanism, which was created to foster peace, are replaced with means to just consider military solutions as the way to control international relations. I would say that this does not bring world stability. This does not help with the question of world peace, and we will not get there without meaningful accountability. Something that Professor Kagan here mentioned at the end of his remarks: stop the crime first, and then we could lay the ground for accountability. International relations, when they consider accountability, this is not only a legal obligation, but this is a moral and practical necessity to move forward from what we are, the moment we're standing in today. Accountability ensures that breaches of international law are not merely noted, but appropriately addressed. Without it, it becomes merely advisory, and that's actually what autocratic states, imperialist states, want us to achieve. I would say that it must also extend beyond rhetoric. We want justice. We apologize to such nation. No, it has to bring reparation. It has to adhere by agreements that states already signed, whether it's the Oslo Agreement, whether it's the borders of whatever. We need to address what we have achieved already and build on it. All what's happening now is taking us decades and steps back. I would say that achieving accountability for the crimes happening in Gaza today is the first step towards a world peace. From this, I wouldn't say that there is a rock bottom, but however, I imagine this as the rock bottom of international application of international law and international agreement of the civilization that we have achieved through wars and blood and massacres. I would say that if we started today by addressing more than 70 years of occupation, we are able to address the genocide in Gaza, move past it towards accountability that adhere to the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. I meant for my remarks today to be short and concise because I believe that the mean to have a civilized conversation is to have everybody included. Thank you so much, Professor Kagan. And we are here, we have like about 15 minutes to take audience questions. We'll start this by taking 3 questions, answering them, and then if there was more time, we'd be happy to take another round. And I don't know if Yvette wants to help us. Yes. Absolutely.
So when you have a question, you can just stand up and then address the question, and if I your hand up first. So please,
Kagan, so you were using the metaphor of self-defense and criminal law in the international context. What are the limits to that metaphor? I mean, does it, map on pretty closely to our common law understanding of self-defense, or are there some kind of limits to that metaphor?
Taking 3, right?
Yes. Go ahead.
I just have a question. So if the case actually gets to trial in the court of law, how would it's possible to address the 75 years of occupation that it says something can be used to stand up in the ICJ case?
Yes, sir.
So I would like to ask both of you to just comment on specifically, since this was really focused on the ICJ ruling, the particular use of the phrase plausible comes from the treaty itself as a standard that has to be met. So that the quote in question is from the section of the ruling that determines whether it's justiciable by this court. In other words, does this fall out, you said, under provisions. So in many, as you put it, like rhetorical uses, people have used that to say, well, clearly there's genocide. The court has said that. And I'm asking from your standpoint as an attorney, or both of you, please, given that what the ruling actually says is this does fall within their jurisdiction, and is it legitimate as an attorney to say that there's a ruling that indicates likely injustice?
All right, should I start? Okay. I'll just go reverse order. I think I read the plausible to mean something like likely or very possible. Like I said, I think it reads analogous to American probable cause, which again doesn't mean you're guilty, but it means there's a significant indication that there's a crime and that this person that is responsible for that crime. I think it's pretty normal for people to misconstrue what courts have actually ruled. I spend half my day usually pointing those things out to students. So I'm sure that happens here. I think that there's been a lot of misconstruing about what genocide means by people on all sides of this. The court did not say a genocide is actually happening. Like I said, a decision like that, yes or no, would not come for a long time. I think that what they found is that, yeah, this is within our jurisdiction because this is likely or very literally, plausibly a genocide. So we need to be concerned about it. We need to tell the active party here, Israel, to not do certain things so as to prevent anything else that might be genocide from happening. Let me go back. I think with the 75 years, it's difficult for me to imagine one single case that would resolve everything, but a number of Palestine issues have been referred to the ICJ, and that is increasing. So several cases have come up about the occupation. There was the case about the wall in the West Bank. I think when we're talking about 75 years, I mean, I think what goes back to the Nakba, the expulsion of Palestinians, and most importantly, not allowing them to return after the 1948 war and the establishment of the State of Israel. There is a legal debate, something that I've written a lot about whether or not the refugees have the right to return and whether they have a right to property restitution and or compensation. Those are definitely issues that could also be referred to the ICJ, but they haven't been yet. And that would be how you'd get a decision on that. Unfortunately, I think as Ms. Omar explained, one of the problems we're having is that of non-compliance. I mean, international law is actually a trust. If you sue me for a routine contract and I just refuse to pay, and you can't get anyone to enforce that against me, then what good was going to court? All law is a social trust, and in international law, it's especially fragile. So when we have, say, recently, the United States saying that a Security Council resolution that demands something is voluntary, that is something that I don't know what the basis in law for that is, but when the most powerful country in the world says that as a statement of its foreign policy, it could really obliterate this enterprise. And I think it's important to understand that without law, we are back to might makes right. And that tells all parties that I guess I should just get stronger and better at fighting. And I'm not sure that's not the world I hope we live in. And I hope we've had enough bloody experience to know the consequences. This question about self-defense and its boundaries, I find it fascinating, and I think it's an untested frontier. I don't think it's especially important on this issue because self-defense never allows even war crimes, right? So even if a country is entirely acting as a self-defense, it still can't disproportionately target civilians. And then when you get to the special intent element, then you get into genocide. I'll tell you actually where I find this fascinating, something we didn't mention, but the tit for tat between Israel and Iran, where Israel bombed an embassy, and then Iran retaliated, and Israel may retaliate again, and we go on, and we could debate where that started. I find that in the international discussions that the right to self-defense, which is definitely in the UN Charter, is conflated with a right to retaliate. And that is definitely something, say, in routine criminal law. If you are coming at me right now with a baseball bat, I can hit you at that moment because I have an exigent need, but I can't hit you tomorrow, right? But in international law, there seems to be a claim by governments that I think is getting accepted without a lot of protest, that the right to self-defense becomes a right to retaliate or a right to revenge. I think that's very problematic, and I think needs a lot more attention in international law. And actually now would be the time to do it because we're in a cycle of that kind of tit for tat where nobody can agree who started it and where supposedly everyone's trying to calibrate it. So I'll hit you just hard enough that you don't respond, and it doesn't seem to be working out quite right.
I actually have two comments to address the three questions. Thank you for starting the answer. But also on the fragility of international law, I believe that international law is a tool that could be utilized by everyone, not just states, by all people. You can use items in the international law to influence your government, to influence your regional courts, your regional representation. And I believe that this is a moment that either will change the people understanding of how you could utilize international law. It's not very vague to everyone anymore. And that gives me hope. On the question of the ICJ statement that it's plausible, the violation in Gaza, and if this is an indication of the ruling or the decision after that, I will give an example from the case of Serbia against Kosovo, 2007, where the ICJ found, regardless of all the unprecedented and the staggering evidence that was provided in this case, the horrible facts that were gathered, the numbers and the level of documentation, the court still acquitted Serbia. And however, they determined that they failed to prevent acts of genocide. And this could be the result of any review by the ICJ. I would say that the ICJ, the ICC, all international mechanisms either influenced by states that they represent or the people. A few months ago, the Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the ICC, went to Israel, took a picture with the Al-Aqsa Mosque and posted that he was in Israeli Jerusalem. How come that this is abiding by international law? I would say no. Therefore, I would say that it's not straightforward whatever any international mechanism decide. The people could influence those mechanisms and actually get what they needed to get, or what they needed to find justice for. We have 7 minutes, I believe. Probably one more question.
With the upcoming elections in November, finally become front runners, do you think there would be any difference in how the United States acts within the UN if one or the other wins in November?
You answered.
You want
I don't have a vote.
So this question definitely has a lot of like abstractness to it as well, but maybe it can inspire like a collective thought towards action. So there's a lot of students in here who have been local organizers with close proximity to electoral politics, and especially locally. And I think a lot of people are just taken aback with the lack of response that we're getting from our legislators. It's a lot of gaslighting, or, you know, we don't handle those global affairs, things like that. And my question is, how can student organizers use the context of international law and the implications of its negligence to make headway in the discussions with legislators or within our disruptions to bring more awareness and inspired action to really create change? Because if it's not being done and it's being avoided, how can we let them know that we're smarter than we think we are? If that, and I know it's hard, but it can maybe inspire some dialogue.
We welcome international advice on how to solve our.
It's always smarter than the government or the representatives. I think that has been proven by many examples. Las Vegas is one of the most silent politically on international politics I've ever lived in, and I've been around the world. And recently I've seen hundreds marches in the street and counter marches, and people are discussing Israel-Palestine in the streets and billboards, whether for this side or this side. I feel that people are provoked when they are engaged, and
when they are engaged, they are able to influence. I feel that people always like vote for their representative minding national issues. However, when they learn that Senator Rosen is actually on the appropriation committee and she votes for military aid to Israel and to Egypt and to other authoritarian systems, I believe that people would consider that when they cast a vote for her or for any other similar representative. I believe that the rise in awareness about how the US is contributing to wars around the world, people have voted uncommitted. Actually, I've seen Americans who didn't know about the uncommitted vote. This is actually growing in the engagement between the people and the representatives. It's a movement, it's happening, it's gonna continue. How do we raise it? Organize. I come from the third world where there was the Arab Spring revolutions, people standing in front of the live bullets. And I would say that the way towards that was through innovative organizing. Back then, Facebook, Twitter was a new trend, and the governments did not realize that it would be a way for organizing. People utilized this successfully, and boom, I would say that the younger generations has always solutions to negate all the sustainable narratives, and they are able to prevail. I would say key is organizing in all forms, and Professor Kagan actually has an idea for this.
I do?
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, oh, I'll mention that, yes, okay, so I believe it or not, of all of the questions I anticipated in this, I think this question about the election is probably the one I feared most, because I think that the situation, I think that the way President Biden has handled this has made this election a whole lot more difficult than it ought to be. Given the other work that they do, trying to do what we can to defend immigrants right here on this campus and in our community here, the way in which Donald Trump, I think, he's not solely responsible, but he's been a catalyst for unleashing a level of racial hatred that I thought I would only have heard about in history books in our country, threatening people I know and see every day. It would be very difficult for me to not vote for Joe Biden, which is the only choice available to avoid him, but it has become much more difficult. Given I have always, actually most of my life, have argued with people who said that there's no difference between them, and I've actually always argued vote for the lesser of two evils. But the reality is that we didn't really mean evil; we meant mediocre. And I cannot argue with someone who says, even if I normally would do that I can't vote for someone who sends bombs to a plausible genocide. And I think that right now, I admire the uncommitted movement. I think it is rational, whether you agree with me about who to actually vote for or not. I think it is rational to make the Democrats nervous. Play your cards close. Don't be taken for granted. And because when you're taken for granted, you don't count. And I would further say that while we have a binary choice, because for better or for worse, they're not just the likely, barring an actuarial check to their nominees. And the elections are only one part of it. And this is something that I had not thought deeply about until working in Egypt, actually. Egypt, Yasmin and I shared a mentor who taught me a lot about this. I've thought a lot about this. So Egypt did not have free and fair elections. Hosni Mubarak was ragingly popular, won every election with 95%. Amazing guy. Yeah, although he seems actually a lot nicer in retrospect. So that's a different panel. The thing is that one of the things that I thought about is that one of the problems that I saw there wasn't just that, okay, the president is not really freely elected. Democracy is a lot deeper than just selecting the person in one office. It's a constant dialogue between government at all levels and the people at all levels. I think it was Franklin Roosevelt who told a group of activists, make me do it. And I think President Obama repeated that to some people, and I think that is important here. So that's all I think I can say on this right now. But like I said, I don't think it should be as hard right now for people to decide on this question as it is.
And Jewish for Peace.
Oh, yes, thank you very much. She's reminded me twice. So for those who are interested, some people that I've met recently and I are working to establish and hope to establish a chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace in Nevada, where there is none right now. If you are like me, someone of Jewish background and concerned about these issues and would like to be involved, please send me an email. You can find my email by Googling my name, Michael Kagan at UNLV, and find it that way. Though it is not a UNLV initiative, and I'll transfer you to my personal email after that, but they find me that way and let me know, and I will let you know how we can get more involved. That was my idea, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. As we conclude our discussion today, oh, yes, round of applause. As we conclude our discussion, I just want to give a heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed panelists, Professor Kagan and attorney Yasmin Omar, for their insightful contributions to our understanding of what's happening with the humanitarian and legal status in Palestine. Their expertise and passion has really left me inspired, as I'm sure it has left you as well. And I think it really sheds light on our responsibility to give Palestinians our immediate attention and a promise for collective action. As we get ready to leave, I urge all of you to reflect on the stories and insights that were shared today. Let us not leave this discussion in this room. Instead, enter it into your everyday conversations as you bring awareness to others, not just in spaces where there's like-minded folks, but where your powerful presence had the opportunity to open the minds and hearts of others. Whether it's raising awareness or advocating for policy change, supporting student-led initiatives, each of us have a role and responsibility to play in advancing justice and human rights. Before I thank our panelists, I would like to leave everyone with a quote from the great Maya Angelou. She says, "Do your best until you know better. And then when you know better, do better." I hope we all take her advice and leave this room doing better. Finally, thank you once again to our panelists and to our student organizers. We had several clubs organize this along with the UNLV Palestine Coalition. We have the UNLV Feminist Club, whose president is here. That's Sophie, and then also the Middle Eastern Law Student Association at Boyd Law, Mike is representing them as well. And the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion helped us make this possible as well. And President Whitfield has shown support for bringing events like this to campus, and I'm really grateful that we are at this university. So please give yourselves and our speakers a final round of applause.
Just one.
Yay.
I was thinking she was reminding me twice.
Well,
Just one more thing. Sorry. We just have an event coming up, another one on Thursday, May 2nd at 7 p.m. in the Beirut Museum of Art. It'll be a Palestinian poetry night. We'll have catered food, have artists and writers from around the city reading out poems from Palestinian writers. And if you want more information on that, you can leave your email with Jackie or follow us on Instagram. We'll post it. Thank you.